You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello. Today we are happy to host a conversation with artists Hock, Edgar Heap of Birds, and Keith Christensen on the occasion of their exhibition in Union at Open Source Gallery in New York, highlighting the Native role in a union strike, union families, and environmental protests. The conversation today will be hosted by Matt Peterson. Edgar Heap of Birds has worked as an artist, activist, and teacher. Heap of Birds' artwork confronts unacknowledged histories of state and settler violence against Native communities in the United States. Keith Christensen is an artist and designer. His work includes a focus on social justice issues. He created Game Turn, Learning from the Minneapolis Truckers Strike of 1934, a book and board game installation. Matt Peterson, who will be hosting the conversation, is an organizer at Woodbine, an experimental space in New York City. He co-directed the film Spaces of Exception in 2018 and co-edited the book The Mohawk Warrior Society in 2022. So Matt, I will pass it off to you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, so we were talking earlier how you said you met about 30 years ago here in New York, but there's an interesting story you talk about in the publication connected to the book about how you had this encounter in 2021 at the George Floyd Square and were struck by some of the imagery you saw there, banners, murals, protest signs, etc. I'm curious if you could talk about that encounter in Minneapolis and how that kind of shaped the trajectory of this project.
Good to be here, Matt. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith Christensen. It started from my point of view in 2021. I think it was September. Edgar was visiting Minneapolis, and the first thing he wanted to do was to see the George Floyd Square. And so we went there, and it's for those who haven't been there, it's a real sad sight. It's a site of the police murder, but it was also the site of all this memorial information and posters, and it's a very visual site. And it's kind of sad, but also poignant and also very active. And we kept looking at it. And I remember Edgar said to me, this is where the real art is. It's not in the museums. It's right here, because it's a critical juncture. And things changed since then, and it's changing now. But it's a real point of reflection and understanding, and for us, a commitment to do something about it.
Yeah, hi, this is Edgar. I wanted to add, just remarking on that experience, that memorials are very important in my art practice. I'm always involved with memorializing a lot of Native life struggles and violence against Native people. And in 91, I made a major outdoor 400-foot piece about the hangings in Mankato when Abraham Lincoln executed 38 Dakota warriors after the Civil War, Civil War era, and that was done with the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis. So having Floyd memorialized kind of echoed that, but then again, you have to wonder about the prominence of that memorial versus, the millions of Natives that have died across all of history of this whole hemisphere, which is hardly ever remarked upon. So anyway, coming to that fact and then looking at unions and Native struggles particularly, I think that was very appropriate.
Edgar, you were mentioning you wanted to talk a little bit about the open source gallery itself as a kind of renegade site of exhibition, and you mentioned the George Floyd Square being this particular site of artistic expression. Do you want to talk about the gallery and this installation? Yeah,
it's very modest. It's just like a 2-car garage on the street in Brooklyn, and often those kinds of more informal venues are better to make explicit expressions, and we have just about maybe a handful of works in the venue, but having it on the street, having it kind of be like a informal puncture into the art world of New York City is very remarkable, and I look forward to seeing what happens after this. When people come to see the show, they get the book. There's posters. There's all kinds of information that's been delivered and goes into what's happening with the water protectors as well in the north of America.
I'd like to say that our approach to the project, the main intention of the project, is to enlarge this meaning of solidarity, and we kind of conceptualize the project as to being part of the past, this 1934 truckers strike, this big labor strike in Minneapolis, but also personal. It relates to Edgar's own family history of working with unions, and finally the present, which is the current activism of the water protectors and progressive movement.
Yeah, so I think one of the particular specific interventions that the show is making is to connect, Native struggles with labor struggles, or, specifically union struggles, which I think is interesting and, hasn't really been done as much before. And, you're doing that through the site of Minneapolis, I think through your work, Keith. But I mean, it's interesting to try to blur these potential contradictions around like class or race or who the kind of legitimate radical subjects are supposed to be, and how those things blur. Do you want to talk about the impetus to connect this labor and Native kind of struggle in a new way, I think?
Sure. I've been active with the Remember 1934, which is a collective group in Minneapolis, Minnesota, generally, about commemorating this great strike that happened in 1934 that basically was an effort during this harsh time, during the Depression, and it looked very unpromising at that moment. But they organized, they fought for the right to organize, and they won that strike. And to me, it was evidence of a collective action. And this is kind of the basis for going forward into the water protectors movement is collective action again. And the whole theme of this whole project has been collective action is been part of Native culture and part of progressive action in the labor movement. And let me say also that the kind of entree into this strike was through two individuals. One was Emanuel Hap Holstein and Ray Rainbolt, and they were Native guys. And as part of this strike, they were participants in it. They were no more and no less part of the group. It was a collective action, and they were embraced. They were part of the action. They suffered. They struggled. They fought, and they were embraced by this strike. So I don't mean to imply that they were the leaders of the strike, but they were certainly part of the core of it. And that's kind of the point of this project, that Natives have been involved with social change. And going back to Edgar and our conversation, he said, and I told him about these two guys, part of this strike effort. And he said, Natives weren't included in anything. and that's kind of the part of it, is like in Edgar's work has long been about interrogating history and looking at some of the other facts and kind of reshaping it. And his effort was to do his work with his language, his treatment, and kind of highlight these individuals who are practically nameless in history, and frankly, it was very hard finding source materials about them. But it's kind of the point. They were the hidden history that were a major part of this effort that basically changed labor history in the 30s and for decades after that. And it's certainly been suffered, the labor movement, but they did it. And that's kind of a key takeaway from that they fought the good battle, and it was a collective battle. They struggled, some of them died, but they won it.
Well, for me, one of the major points, going back to Floyd and then also going into this labor activism history, is that the Native society, the Native citizens haven't had the currency, as Keith mentioned, to be represented. And so Floyd, for African American people, one of my old pet peeves is the Good Times movie TV show with J.J. Walker, and kind of the African American buffoon, and that becomes, but you become part of American society if you can be a buffoon, And so natives never had a bad buffoon. we don't even exist on TV, So, but you have to be a buffoon to be on TV, kind of. You have to be made fun of. You got to be a butt of jokes and whatever. I mean, going back into all kinds of black entrees into the media in Hollywood. Often it's with servants or they're being joked about, and so on in a negative way. So natives have not been in that kind of sphere, so they haven't existed, So looking at the unions has been very important to see how they were involved with labor, they were involved with industry, and the particular people we're talking about in my particular family, the Cheyenne Arapaho people from Oklahoma, there are 39 tribes in Oklahoma. They were brought there from all across America. They were disenfranchised. They were excluded from their tribal homelands, and they came to Oklahoma. And there was nothing to do there in terms of industry. There was just farm labor, migrant labor work. And so many of the tribal people went to north of Oklahoma to Kansas, to Wichita. And there, during the Cold War, there was Boeing, Beech Aircraft, later Learjet, and also Cessna. So all the aircraft factories were there for the industry. And then that's where my family found labor, and also all the other 39 tribes found labor. And then that led also to union organizing. So then they actually became participants. Without media, without Hollywood or television, they actually became participants in American society. And so we need to have that known as a fact and have that kind of unpacked, that tribal people have been part of the American fabric as well.
No, yeah, I think it's really important because typically, when we think or hear about, the process of settler colonialism in the U.S., it's thought of as like, colonial forces wanted the land, but didn't know what to do with the people and didn't see them as workers and created this kind of surplus population. But I think your project mentions that no, like Native people did in fact become workers. And this kind of, this story you're telling of Hap Holstein is really amazing. He goes from leaving the reservation to becoming a dancer, to becoming a labor organizer. He's charged with killing a police officer. He joins the Communist League of America. He's known of as a red among reds. It's just a really dense, fascinating history of these different, navigating these different spatial, cultural, racial, labor existences or something. And just to think this is just some guy in Minnesota, how many other characters or figures or individuals are like that or something, I think is really fascinating about the work you're doing in that historical excavation. And I think one of the banners up at the show says, do not dance for pay, which I think was really nice. I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, that's do not dance for pay. That's my my moniker, I guess, and I present it on many levels. But of course, we want to talk about why natives weren't really analyzed or participating in culture, and because the tourism and the kind of the romantic image of Native people, like on Gunsmoke or any of those old shows, all the natives are played by white people with wigs on, and they're still on TV. I see them on TV, and so even on in the media, the natives are erased. But to think about that and to think about, well, what do we have instead? And we have a lot of very romantic art, like Bambi art, we call it, romantic pastoral art that natives would make themselves, honestly, but for the white dollar, And so they've actually been complicit in their own erasure. So I challenge all the native artists to not dance for pay. And we have a lot of feel-good art, even in New York City. We have a ton of it made by contemporary native artists. And there's very little political art in New York City from native people, and so that's been filtered by the museums and galleries and to make money, So I really challenge everybody to look at that very hard and to not dance for pay.
And let me say, this is a collaboration that we've decided to merge our imagery, and so there's a juxtaposition. And Edgar's "Do Not Dance for Pay" is juxtaposed with my figurative treatment. It was a nod toward the water protectors. Basically, it has two canaries, and it has some fists, and it has natural elements. And the point of it is you have to fight for nature because it's being eroded. And to me, this "do not dance for pay" is a stab at capitalism. It's a way of saying, no, it doesn't have to rule. We have a force of collective action to confront that. So that was my tie into the water protectors purposefully.
And then, I want to talk a little bit about this environmental struggle question that's part of the project you're doing. But, obviously the Line 3 struggles within Minneapolis are part of this kind of site exploration, excavation that you're doing. But, right now there's just this train derailment in Ohio this week that's released tons of kind of toxic chemicals in the air. And, yesterday here at e-flux, there was this benefit for this earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And there's this idea that like natural disasters aren't really natural, because the built infrastructural environment of kind of our industrial world is so toxic and corrosive or something. So if things just go slightly wrong, a pipeline leaks or something, a slight crack in the system and, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, are just devastated, or generations are devastated or something. And, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the factor of that within the project you're doing, of this kind of environmental activism and thinking about the land. I think from my own work, typically, these traditional tribal territorial native lands are what in New York City we see as like peripheral kind of faraway lands, but that's precisely where all the infrastructure is of like power plants and dams and pipelines, et cetera. So there's this renewed consciousness, I think, of the periphery, in these dense urban spaces where the periphery is where all of the infrastructure is built that enables the metropolis to exist or something. So how that environmental consciousness and those struggles, how you're trying to fit that into your project a bit.
It's a good point that we're all connected. It's a small world, and we kind of need each other. And these disasters are not isolated; they're really related. So, I will say that the water protectors movement, led by Honor the Earth group, which is founded by Winona LaDuke, but she's very embedded with the tribal culture there and the participation there. But I will say there's also a big contingent of the allies. And I have to say I consider myself an ally. I'm working with Edgar, and I'm supportive of it, of this project, but it's with the connection with his voice. And I don't want to step over that. I want to support with my role. But I think that a lot of the things are happening in northern Minnesota on tribal lands, and there's been a lot of activity there, although a lot of support in Minneapolis and the urban areas for that ongoing effort. But I think a lot of people take pride in the fact that it's indigenous-led, and it's inspiring that way.
Well, one of the pieces in the book is water is your only medicine, and that's an important remark. It comes from the water protectors and from Standing Rock, the action at Standing Rock, and I made a series of two basketball courts are been presented right now in Long Island City by PS1, and they're both paintings about water, and so I made that kind of as a very positive sensibility about water awareness, and but often people don't really care about the natural forces unless it hurts them. So the water in New York will be remarkable when it has a hurricane and floods the subways. Then suddenly everyone realizes, oh, water, oh my, Well, it's good to think about it before it happens and to actually respect it already, which we need to bring more awareness in this project and others to the natural elements and the good things about them, but to respect them and engage with them before it actually has to hurt you.
Yeah, there's a quote in here just about in an interview that you did with Monica, Edgar, where you say, I find the metaphor of a labor union, and it's interesting you refer to labor union as a metaphor, I find the metaphor of a labor union to be very similar to the tribal template of responsibility towards youth and elders. Community at large must be served first. I think that was interesting to think about the kind of connection you're doing here. Yeah, do you want to talk?
Yeah, well, that's just the way the tribes behave as nations. They always care for the elders. They take care of them first, the youth as well. And my tribe particularly is very, very active with support toward elders and youth. They have a fund. It comes from gaming, but it goes to elders first, then it goes to youth. Then the people in the middle kind of get their share in a way. But it's always about that respect to the elders and the legacy they have, the knowledge they have, and the health issues that they might be suffering from, and the collective kind of extended family that you have to maintain. So of course, New York and elsewhere, it's very much a singular individual freedom. Like it's even the Constitution that Americans have made. It's about the individual. It's about you or me, and it's not really. It shouldn't be like that. It's about us. It's about your family and the responsibility to those, and then you extend that to the natural world. The animals and the waters, the sky, all those kind of things. So yeah, labor unions were there. They helped my family when my father worked for Beech Aircraft, and I quote in there that we had a Christmas when there was no presents, but the labor union brought the presents because they cared about the families, and the company didn't. They would hire other people to take up the jobs, but the union took care of the families.
So Keith and I don't know if there's anything else you guys want to convey about the show or the publication or your project to listeners or people in New York, but also people that might not be able to get to see the show. If you want to share more.
I do. Thanks, Matt. I'd like to say that it wasn't just Edgar and I for the book, and we created the book with Monica Wers and Open Source Gallery support for this to bring in a kind of a context for it, because we have a limited amount of physical space to show the work, but we thought the book would provide more context. And there was a number of contributors who generously donated their work, their ideas, and their experiences. So I wanted to share who they were. Mike Alowitz wrote about his own experiences with the 1934 activists. He actually, as a young political activist, had met some of the older veterans of the strike and had some personal incidents to convey and to share that. But the passion of those guys continues through his own work as a political artist and a muralist. We have in the book also some very strong activist artists, including Carrie Pickett, who's done a documentary on Winona LaDuke and among other fine films, and she's a wonderful photographer, and she's part of it. She contributed her work and her own perspective of being right at the front lines of these engagements, and I keep thinking about the kind of the parallels of this 34 strike, where they were fist to cuff and they were bleeding on the streets in Minneapolis, and they're still doing that in northern Minnesota, fighting these cops, getting arrested, putting themselves on the line for that. So her work is really documenting that so well. John Kim is another activist artist who's actually going all over the world. He was in Berlin last summer, meeting with urban and community of scholars about the Anthropocene and how the water protection relates to that. Recently, I know he was in Chile, so he's very active with the international community and trying to extend the efforts locally to where it's happening throughout the world. Yates McKee is another contributor for the book, and he wrote I think a fine essay about the connections between the Occupy movement. He was a participant here in New York and years earlier, and his own perspective as an art historian and labor and social activist is a great voice to have with it. So it provides us a context for the project.
My mother, Margaret Heap of Birds, is a Arapaho elder, and she was an employee at the Beech Aircraft plant in Wichita, and she was a union steward. And so this book has brought back a lot of memories for her, and I consulted with her to make the book as well. And so she has a lot of stories and a lot of experiences about working with the union. And then my brothers and sisters, 6 of us in my family, the children, siblings, and we all compared ideas and memories of being union children in a kind of a segregated part of Wichita, Kansas, where the aircraft workers lived. So this whole event of having the exhibition, having the book, has been a community event, even within my family. And so there was even a portrait painted of my father, who was also a union member in the trucking area of the factory. He's from Oklahoma, and everyone moved back from Wichita, except for one brother, to Oklahoma, to the reservation. So it was sort of a failed experiment to be in the mainstream society. So we all come back to Oklahoma. I live in Oklahoma certainly since the 80s as well. But I've been able to give them the book. So I went home to my family and gave them all books, and they like to have them. They want to have them, and they want to read about what our lives are centered upon. So it's been a good community kind of effort that we've really endorsed. Yeah.
Well, Keith and Edgar, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your work and the project and book and show. And everyone should go see it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. And I also want to mention that we will include a link to Hakievi Edgar Heap of Birds' piece published in e-flux Architecture, Our Red Nations Were Always Green, in the show notes. Thank you.